Laura Nelson is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia, and has published in a wide variety of outlets, including American Journal of Sociology, Gender and Society, and Sociological Methods and Research. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura, and we're excited to hear what you have to share.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is my first talk in Canada, if you don't count the job talk at UBC. So I'm very excited to be at my new position and learning more about Canadian sociology, etc. So thanks for having me. So I'm going to start with 3 proclamations, 3 takeaway points I hope everyone takes away from this talk today. The first is interaction effects does not capture intersectionality, and I will offer different ways of doing so here. The second is that machine learning is inductive. It is a fundamentally mathematically inductive method, which I will talk about. And I want to propose that and perhaps the future of machine learning is qualitative, which is perhaps the more provocative proclamation here, but I will hope to convince at least some of you that that is the case. So I'm just going to lay some groundwork. I know that interdisciplinary audiences, we often use the same terms, but use different definitions for the same terms. So I'm just going to quickly define a few terms here for what I'm using today. So the term bias has a few different meanings. There's statistical bias, which is the objective difference between an estimator's expected value and the true value of the parameter being estimated. So I might talk about statistical bias today. And then there's also social bias, which is being in favor or against individuals or groups based on their social identities. And typically, when I talk about bias today, I'm talking about social bias, being in favor or against individuals. And I will talk about deductive and inductive methods. And I use these in the social science sense. So deductive, you start with the theory or hypothesis, you analyze data, and then you see if your hypothesis is supported or not. And in social science, the inductive method, you gather data, you look for patterns in the data, and you develop theory out of that data. So just kind of a simple inductive, deductive methods here. All right, I want to talk a little bit about statistics and machine learning today. So inferential statistics, you assume a known relationship in your data and you assess fit. And it's very mathematical. You assume a theoretical mathematical relationship, and in that sense, it's very rigid. So you're proposing a relationship, you assess the fit, and you look at statistical significance. That all-important p-value, is it or is it not significant? And what's great about this method is it offers very interpretable parameters. So you get the beta coefficient, which tells you the exact relationship between, for example, education and income, and that can be a very powerful way of modeling the social world. And we've been using it for decades, of course, in the social sciences. It was critiqued early on by a lot of people, including feminist scholars, critical race scholars, etc., for trying to propose this kind of godlike view, this view from nowhere, which flattens out the social world in a perhaps unhelpful way. It's not maybe a linear relationship. There's other types of relationships. So there's many different ways that people critiqued inferential statistics, the way it was being used. The first is intercategorical complexity. So this kind of way of knowing couldn't capture differences, categories that weren't common categories in the social world. So we often didn't have enough data to capture social categories that may be very important, but we just don't have enough data to capture these different or unusual categories in our data. The second is intracategorical complexity. So each of us are made up of complex intersecting identities. So to flatten it out into just like race and class as different variables was, according to some critiques, an unhelpful way of presenting the way that we capture intersectionality in each kind of individual here. The third is anti-categorical complexity. So there may be some social categories, some variables that we don't know are important that might be very important to the social world. So by positing a priori categories, saying I'm only going to look at these variables, we may miss really important variables and categories that can help us explain the social world. And another critique is the type of processes that these types of statistics capture are not the processes, the everyday processes, interactional variables that really explain the social world and can explain things like the perpetuation of inequality. So things like institutional ethnography were proposed to capture these everyday processes that, according to many, were more important if we're really trying to understand the social world. So we have this social science that uses this inferential statistics paradigm. We have these critiques of inferential statistics. And recently, we have now seen the rise of a new paradigm, which is machine learning. So just to define machine learning in the way I use it, machine learning is the algorithms and statistical models that computer systems use to perform a specific task without using explicit instructions, relying on patterns and inference instead. So this definition will become important later. But what it did for social sciences, which I think is really exciting, is it's able to address many of the critiques people were leveraging at traditional quantitative inferential statistic methods. So we have just more data. We have a ton of data on a ton of different groups. So we can look at different types of categories in quantitative ways that we couldn't do previously. So you might be interested, for example, in women over 50 who play Xbox games, which previously would be very hard to gather data on. Now we can gather a lot of data on these kind of niche groups of people. So we have more data, which allows us to do more stuff. We have high dimensional data, so we capture more dimensions on each individual data point, so we can capture the kind of complex intersecting identities that we and people and units are made of. So we have that high dimensions that we can deal with. We have unsupervised methods, so we can throw a bunch of variables into a model and see which ones float to the top, which ones are significant. So we don't have to assume a priori we know which categories and variables are important, but we can allow them to emerge from the data. And the type of data we have access to is just really qualitatively different than standard survey data. So we have interactional variables, we have access to a lot of these everyday processes that are really important for the way the social world works. So we can quantitatively model this in ways that was very difficult to do previously when it was so expensive to collect data, when it was very hard to collect data like this. So the question now becomes, how do we merge all these paradigms? How do we merge kind of the standard inferential statistics, which we've been doing for decades, with maybe some of the theories in social science and machine learning? So that's what social science is grappling with right now, is how do we kind of combine all of these methods and develop a new approach or change our approach to social science. And one of the things that's happening is the machine learning paradigm, the way machine learning works, is clashing with the way we've been doing statistics for a long time. So instead of assuming known relationships, we assume unknown relationships and we fit the data. So the relationships come out of the data. And that way it's a very empirical method and it's elastic, right? It can be changed as you add more data, as you change your model, as you train more data. And the way you assess models is quite different. You look for generalizability. So if you train your model on one data set, does it work for other data set, unseen data, other data? So that's kind of how we assess how good a model is in machine learning. And what's frustrating for me is that it can be a black box. It can be used for prediction, and it doesn't produce those nice parameters that can help us understand what the model is telling us about the social world. So these last two things have kind of, social scientists are saying, what do we do with this? How can we handle kind of the different ways that machine learning is dealing with quantitative data and quantitative modeling? And one of the kind of issues I think that we're running up against is inferential statistics is fundamentally mathematically a deductive method. Of course, it's used in inductive ways, but fundamentally it's a deductive method, whereas machine learning fundamentally is an inductive method. Again, it can be used in deductive ways, but fundamentally, foundationally, it's an inductive method. And I am talking about supervised machine learning. So all of machine learning, including supervised machine learning, is a fundamentally inductive method. And so this requires us to think about the way we're using it in different ways. And one of the kind of examples of why or how the social scientists are struggling to kind of merge these two perspectives is through Matt Salganik's Fragile Families Challenge, which had really interesting outcomes. So he used the Fragile Families data set, which is a really rich, it was collected years ago, a really rich data set of early childhood variables, and then they tracked people to capture life outcomes. So it's a really nice longitudinal data set. And so he put a challenge out to the scientific community and said, we have all these new methods, really powerful methods. I challenge you to develop a model, a machine learning model, to predict life outcomes from these early childhood variables in a way that we haven't been able to do with logistic regression alone. And so a bunch of teams submitted their models and he assessed them using accuracy measures. And what he found surprised him and disappointed him. So the best most complicated machine learning submission did very little better than the benchmark logistic regression model. And so what he concluded was, him and his team concluded was, despite using a rich data set and applying machine learning methods optimized for prediction, so using them exactly how they're supposed to be used, the best predictions were not very accurate and were only slightly better than those from the simple logistic regression benchmark regression model. So overall, he said these results suggest practical limits to the predictability of life outcomes in some settings. So it didn't achieve the great accuracy level that he was hoping this achieved. And Duncan Watts has weighed in on prediction as well using machine learning. He says the real world is complex and history only plays out once. Duncan Watts is a long-term computational social scientist. So it's not that we can't predict anything, he says. The problem is the predictions we most want to make are precisely the ones we can't make. So I want to propose to the machine learning community, the computational social science community, that we can perhaps use these methods in a different way, and we can get more out of the methods than if we use them in this kind of prediction mode or this trying to bolster inferential statistics mode. So rather than treating machine learning as a quantitative method with an inferential statistics epistemology, so trying to just bolster what we've always done, why don't we treat this as a quantitative method with a qualitative epistemology? And this, I claim, will allow us to get more analytical power out of these methods and use them in a way to truly kind of revolutionize or change the way that we do social science. So I'm going to demonstrate one way that I use these methods in a qualitative way with the example of the 19th century US South and looking at intersectionality in the 19th century US South. So this picture is neither from the South nor the 19th century. It's from Chicago in 1913, but it kind of demonstrates the reality of this century, which it was it's always intersectional, but this century was particularly intersectional. Black women did not experience this century the same way that white women did, certainly, and they did not experience this century the same way that Black men did. And we know a lot about this, right? Historians have written a lot about how the different people with different social identities experience this century very differently. So it's a case we know a lot about. So I came in thinking, how can we use these methods to both demonstrate the power of these methods in a qualitative way, but also help us maybe show how a different lens may bring up more issues in this, or help us understand this century in a different way with a different lens using machine learning methods. So the data I use here is from Documenting the American South, which is a digital online library at the University of North Carolina. It's a bunch of first-person narratives of people who experienced this century. It's a lot of ex-slaves, women, laborers, soldiers, so people who aren't typically in the scientific record here. And so from this, I'm using 414 kind of book-length first-person narratives by white women, white men, Black women, and by Black men or about Black persons. So this offers kind of a rich, diverse first-person data set that I can use to examine intersectional issues here. The method I use is word embeddings. So I don't want to get too technical here, but the intuition behind word embeddings is that if you're trying to, for example, compare two different texts, the text on the left there, social scientists may recognize as Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. Text on the right is Machiavelli's The Prince. So we could compare the frequency of the use of the word working across these two texts. So think about the difference. But word embeddings take the assumption that it's also the way the word is used, not just the frequency, but the way that is used. And we understand the way that it is used by looking at all the other words that co-occur with it. So word embeddings build a vector of the word. So we're not just doing a count, we're doing a vector. And the vector is constructed based on all the words that co-occur with the word, for example, working across your entire corpus. So we get these vectors of words, and it's built using prediction in machine learning. So for example, it would train a word embedding model on a corpus by looking at phrases like sociological imagination, and it would take V in imagination and it would try to predict sociological. And so it does this iteratively, and when it can predict sociological accurately, that builds the model. So that's the skip-gram model. It can also build it, the continuous bag of word model, the other way. So you give it the word sociological, and it tries to predict the surrounding, the imagination. And it does this again inductively by looking at the way the words, the context and the words are used across the entire corpus, and it's predicted like that. So you build this word embedding model, and you create a distance between every word and every other word. So you get a relational map of all the words in your corpus. And words that are close together in the corpus, you assume are semantically similar. Words are used in a similar way. Words that are far apart from each other are not semantically similar. So one of the first large word embedding models that was built on Google Books by computer scientists, they created analogies, which is a common thing in word embeddings. So you can read this as women are to sewing as men are to carpentry, women are to nurse as men are to surgeon, etc. And computer scientists quickly said, wow, there's a lot of bias in this. Why are women compared to interior designers when men are compared to architects, etc.? So they started to work at debiasing word embeddings, which is appropriate if you're going to use these in systems. You don't want a bunch of cultural biases in your systems, like resume recommendation systems. But social scientists got excited and said, well, we can use these to reveal intersecting systems of power, to reveal the kind of cultural biases that are embedded in language that we've been talking about for so long, and we can now kind of model in this way. So using first-person narratives, I push this a little further and say we can reveal the lived experience under intersecting systems of cultural power using these word embedding models on these first-person narratives. So that's how kind of I approach this project here. So intersectionality, it's a broad term that's used in a lot of different ways by a lot of different disciplines, which is great, but it makes it hard to define. So the definition of intersectionality I use is that it is a theoretical framework for understanding how social identities and categories combine with each other, but also interact with systems of social, cultural, economic, and political power to create distinct and unequal lived experiences. So each part of these is important to the definition of the intersectionality. So translating this to word embedding models on the first-person narratives of the 19th century US South, I tried to very much align the method with the definition here. So skip over that. So the way I map this, or the way I'm translating intersectionality to word embeddings, is I'm using them to map 4 combined social identities, Black and white men and women, and 4 social institutions, the polity, the economy, culture, and the domestic, because you need to think about intersectionality interacting with these institutions. I will produce 4 visualizations showing the specific and relational position of each identity embedded within these social institutions, as conveyed in the context of largely pro-abolitionist narratives from the 19th century US South. That's an important point here. These are pro-abolitionists, so it's not just a random sample of narratives from the US South here. So I'm trying to map these identities within these institutions and then show their relational position here. So word embeddings, you can do vector addition or subtraction to create new vectors. So you can create your vector space and you can create new vectors within that space. So to create the 4 social identities, Black and white men and women, I did vector addition and averaging. So take synonym pairs. So for Black women, for example, add the vectors for women plus Black, women plus colored, women plus Negro, etc. Divide by the number of synonym pairs and you get your Black women vector. And you do that for all the 4 social identities. So that again creates this vector space where all of the vectors are related to one another and you can measure distance between them, plus these 4 created vectors here. So for example, you can see what is the distance between vectors is measured with cosine similarity. So what is the distance between white women and dainty? And that's closer than Black men and dainty. So white women are more semantically similar to the dainty vector than Black men. So it's just, this is how I'm measuring these distances. And then for the social institutions, I just take the 50 vectors that are closest to the 4 institution vectors here. So it creates kind of this backdrop to embed these social identities within. And just to give kind of an intuition for what's going on in this data, this is a principal component analysis of those 200 so vectors that make up the 4 social institutions. I'm just interpreting this just to give a sense of what's going on here. On the right, there's practical concerns like chores, babies, ironing. Dues on the left is more aspirational, so accomplishments, endowments, intellectual, etc. And then on the bottom and the top, this is more collective. So collective, practical, like debts and treasury, and collective aspirational, like commonwealth and nation state, and then individual aspirational down here, refinement, endowments. individual practical. Here we get the babies and the milking and the chores. So this is the institutional space I'm embedding these social identities within. And when I embed these social identities within, we can see how the 4 social identities are relationally related to these 4 institutions. And what we can see here, I know this is a lot going on in this graph. So what we can see here is that the culture vector separates by race. So white men and white women are much closer to the culture vector compared to Black men and Black women. So they're more semantically similar to the culture vector. The domestic alternatively separates by gender. So Black women and white women are closer to the domestic variable, and Black men and white men are further away from the domestic variable. Not too surprising. The economy vector has an interesting intersectional dynamic where Black women are almost equally close to the economy vector compared to white men. So whereas gender schema would say women are not a part of the economy, white women are further away from the economy, but Black women are actually much closer to the economy. So it's showing some interesting intersectional dynamics there. Another way of looking at it, same data. This is now just using a bootstrapping method to create 95% confidence intervals. Happy to talk about any of these details later, but this kind of tries to approximate statistical significance in the way that a lot of people want to see. So again, we just see here that Black women and white women are statistically significantly closer to the domestic variable, so it's robust. White women and white men are closer to the culture variable, and then we see the economy, the intersectional dynamics of the economy here. So it's just showing that confidence interval there. So what does this mean? How is this what does this mean in terms of this first person narratives? What does it mean that white men and women are closer to the culture variable? Well, we can see that in the South, the culture words that came up in the model were used almost exclusively to describe white people in the South. And these culture words were very important to defining high culture in the South in this time. So this is a white woman talking about, she lived in Washington, D.C., and when the Civil War happened, they kicked all the Southerners out of Washington, D.C. And so she said, when this happened, all society is departed with my brethren of the South. So words like important words in describing white society in the South at the time in the society. So this is a white man describing his wife, white wife. She was erudite without pedantry, charitable without proprieties, but void of prudery, ever genial, but never frivolous. So this is what we're meaning when we're talking about kind of white culture. It's these culture words that were used to describe white people. And this is like all over, this kind of long description of people like this. We're all over in this data. We don't see this when we see descriptions of Black men and women. We see different types of words being used to describe why to describe good Black people versus good white people. Or we see things like the field hands and such of them have generally excluded from the dwelling of the owners, look to the house servant as a pattern of politeness and gentility. And indeed, it is often the only method of obtaining any knowledge of the manners of what is called genteel society. So this is just explaining that Black people were quite literally separated from genteel society. They did not have access to this society. So what are the different words that were used to describe Black men and women? Things like merit. They have taught him self-reliance and the desire for teamwork. They have taught him thrift. They have given lessons in integrity and high moral purpose. So these words like thrift, self-reliance, merit are very different than the culture words that we saw being used to describe white men and women. So it's a different kind of metric of how you describe people used in these first person narratives. And that's where we're getting the word embedding, pushing Black men and women away from the culture vector and pushing white men and white women towards the culture vector. So it's capturing these different types of words used to describe people in this era. So that's what it's capturing and showing in this word embedding model. Another example is the economy variables, which I said had an interesting intersectional dynamic. So white women during this time were relegated to the domestic sphere. They weren't really allowed out of the domestic sphere, most white women in the South. Black women had to work. They were either forced to work in slavery or they had to work to make money. So this describing Black women as making money was a way to say how good of a person they were. So at the time of her death, this is describing a Black woman. She had acquired by her industry and care more than $400. the whole of which, after paying the expense of her sickness and funeral, she left by will to charitable purposes. So she was great because she made money. Another one, this is actually Sojourner Truth. I thought I would work and put some money in a savings bank, et cetera, et cetera. My industry had doubtless kept some poor wretches from paying work. I felt it and I said, Lord, I will give all back that I have ever taken away. But this is, again, I was able to make money. This is what makes me a good person. So Black women, these are the words that push Black women closer to the economy vector. So slave rebellions were a constant fear for the white population. Black people outnumbered and outstrengthened them in many locations. So they tried to do what they could to quell them. The other theory is that white women had real authority over Black men and Black women, so they could do whatever they wanted to them, so that white women actually had more authority in this period. So when I do the same calculations with authority, what we see here is that Black men and white men were closer to the authority vector compared to white men and Black women. White women and white men were white women and Black women were equally close to the authority vector, and white men and Black men, there was virtually no difference between them. And importantly here, Black men are statistically significantly closer to the authority vector compared to white women. So at least in this text, discursively, Black men, the narrative was upholding gender schema, not racial schema. So Black men were discursively closer to the authority vector compared to white women, even though white women had the real authority. So we can kind of adjudicate between these two theories here. So in sum, culture distinguished the races, domestic words distinguished by gender, the economy had this interesting intersectional dynamic, and authority, at least discursively, upheld traditional gender schemas in this text. So that's what we get from this kind of word embedding. This would just be the beginning here. I would say this is a good way to form hypotheses so we could continue this further. Why didn't politics separate the races as I expected? What are the implications of the role of the economy? Did this map onto the kind of Washington Du Boisian debates of the early 20th century? How did authority present discursively? What are the implications? And then we can use this method, which I think is really powerful, to do comparisons across geographies, times, contexts. So it gives us this kind of quantitative modeling approach that we can use on different data sets, different corpuses, to think about how intersectionality played out differently across contexts and times, et cetera. All right, so what does this mean for the future of machine learning? And I'll just spend 5 minutes talking about this so we can get to discussions. Machine learning is a quantitative method, and I'm claiming here that it should be used with a qualitative epistemology. And that's not the way it's being used, which I think is a missed opportunity. So if you look at the computational social science papers published in the most visible outlets like Science, Nature, Science Advances, they are most often using large amounts of data to try to find universal patterns. So these papers are great. It's just showing a trend in computational social science. So the title here, the nearly universal link between the age of past knowledge and tomorrow's breakthroughs in science and technology, the hot spot. So the nearly universal, right? We're looking for universal patterns across many different diverse contexts. An early one here looked at diurnal and seasonal mood vary with work, sleep, and daylight across diverse cultures. So this whole, we get happier in the summer when it's light out, we're sadder in the winter when it's dark out. But they showed that these patterns hold across Africa, India, UK, US. So this idea that we want to find these universal patterns. Hot streaks in artistic, cultural, and scientific careers. So very, very different careers. We can say there's similar kind of patterns and hot streaks here. So these are the way empirically that computational social science projects are happening. And machine learning is being used to do the traditional inferential statistics paradigm, but kind of do it bigger with more data, more universally. So again, it's trying to implement this godlike view. It's saying we can do this view from nowhere and find these kind of covering laws or social laws that structure society. And that should be the goal of machine learning. As we saw with kind of Matt Selganik and Duncan Watts, it's not working very well. We're not actually able to predict what we think we want to predict. So this is, again, why I'm proposing a different approach to machine learning. We can use it in a qualitative way and get more analytic power out of this. So both qualitative methods and machine learning are relational. They're embedded, they're situational, they're contextual, they're constitutive, they're inductive, they're data-driven, they're uncertain, and they're interpretive. So machine learning is actually more aligned with qualitative methods and qualitative paradigms than it is with inferential statistics. And I really do mean supervised machine learning, not just unsupervised. Machine learning in general is a qualitative method. So how do we leverage this alignment? We can use it to do theory building. So we can use inductive, like grounded theory methods, or abductive. There's a great paper by, I think, Timmermans is on it, about how we can use computational methods for abductive analysis. We need to think about what to do with small n's. And when we say big data, you may say, what do you mean small n's and big data? Computational social science projects are almost always done on a single case. Twitter is a case. Reddit is a case. We may have millions of tweets or millions of comments on Reddit, but the case itself is a single case. And we can use theory and the decades of work in qualitative methods to think about how to deal with single cases or small n's, and how to build theory and generalizable knowledge from small n's. So we can extend it, right? The extended case study method, we could extend it geographically or temporally to think about how mechanisms change across time or space. We can think about odious comparisons a la Steinmetz. So we can think about comparing causal mechanisms, not just descriptions, but comparing causal mechanisms and how they play out in different cases. So don't just focus on the empirics, focus on causal mechanisms. Pasovitz, what can you do with a single case? So he talks about constitutive arguments, where we're using these empirical descriptions that are abstract, so that not just empirically describing the case, but abstracting those categories to think about how they can build greater knowledge more generally. And we can think about exceptional cases. So Ermakov, this idea that exceptional cases can challenge existing categories, challenge the way we think about society. It's this idea that we can come up with new categories or variables that may be important. And that's how we can use these exceptional cases like Twitter, which quite frankly is an exceptional case. So how do we use that to build generalizable knowledge? And then finally, thinking about our analytic lenses, and this comes firmly from ethnography and qualitative methods that I think we need to apply to machine learning cases. What is your level of explanation? Are you looking at the micro, the meso, the macro? What is your subject of explanation? Are you looking at people, places, or mechanisms? And what is your location of explanation? So you're looking at durable dispositions, or are you looking at how the situation influences how people act? So this, for qualitative people, I don't know if there are qualitative people in the room, all of this is like, yeah, this is what we think about. This is how we build qualitative research project. These aren't really thought about very much in computational social science projects so far. This type of kind of thinking about case studies, thinking about your analytic lenses, is not the tradition that machine learning projects are drawing on. They're drawing more on the inferential statistics. So my claim here is if we draw on these qualitative methods, we can actually do a lot more intellectual work and generalizable knowledge building using machine learning compared to the way it's largely being used in a lot of the more visible outlets that we see here. I will end here. This specimen is the Emerald Elysium, by the way. It's part animal, part plant. It doesn't fit into the standard definitions of animal versus plant, which is why I use it as an example. Thank you.
All right, questions, comments? While people are thinking, I'll get us started. We had Carolyn Cinders come and talk to us last year, who is a sort of artist/data scientist who is trying to use community-engaged processes to build up training data sets for machine learning. And so she's specifically doing what's sort of a interesting hybrid actual data/art project, where she's gathering sort of recommendations of data sets associated that could be understood as feminist, to try to shift a lot of the machine learning models. And I think it's still relatively novel, but of course this intersects a lot with all of the critique of bias within machine learning. And so I was curious sort of how you see the role and the opportunity for those of us in social science that are really interested in this intersection to inform what is a very contentious and difficult conversation within the tech sphere around the sort of fundamental biases that exist within a lot of machine learning algorithms.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the role of there's many different roles of social scientists. Of course, there's a very vibrant community specifically around fairness, accuracy, and transparency in algorithms and machine learning. So there is a group of people, a lot of them rooted in the social scientists, who are devoted to this. So that community exists, and that is a entire kind of research track on its own. So there's like that one on the one hand, you have this group that is working on that, and there's a lot of activity going on in ethics in corporations like Google right now, which it's contentious and dynamic. So there is like that is a thing that's going on. Now, social scientists, when we do our own research that perhaps isn't explicitly on ethics and fairness and transparency and machine learning or algorithms, but just we're trying to apply these methods to our own data and our own research, we can emphasize traditions in the social sciences that perhaps may have gotten lost in the physics and the applied mathematicians and the computer scientists who are using this. So just, again, foundational social science things like the data generating process. What is in our data? So not just blindly applying an algorithm to Google News or Google Books or whatever benchmark data set is out there, but really thinking about what's in that data set. So Google Images, ImageNet, for example, which is the main data used to train machine vision algorithms. If you look at ImageNet, you may be surprised to find the categories that are in there. For example, homeless people, an image of homeless people is marked as degenerate. And so there's like these very obvious kind of biases in that. So just thinking about the data generating process, what is in your data and how to kind of build and what that says about your analysis it's now being thought of more, but it wasn't then. So basic social science things. And what's important to me is things like partial perspectives. So not claiming that one data set can provide the view of all of the social world, which is largely how this is being used. So I can create one machine learning model, and this is the kind of modeling the law that dictates all of society. That's not the case, and it's never the case. So you have to think about what's in your data. What is it modeling? Who is it relevant to? And that's what a lot of feminist data people are looking at, is saying, your model is good and it tells us something, but it tells us something about a small slice of the social world, and how can we put those scope conditions on? And that, I think, goes a long way to thinking about bias. So you're not just claiming, well, this explains everything. It might explain the average, which is largely white men, for example. So that type of thing. So bringing the foundational social science knowledge that we learn in year one in the social sciences, and just really thinking about how that applies to machine learning. So that's what I would say the role of social scientists is, if you're not going down the road of being a researcher specifically about kind of bias and transparency in machine learning, which is another avenue you could go down.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think in looking at a lot of the existing word embedding models, I was really struck by when trying to apply those to audiences that I know have very significant differences, and then having to kind of go back and see, okay, can I actually build my own training data set? And knowing that, yeah, the default sets that are available and can be really great probably aren't going to work for my data. Yeah. And that was a hard thing to like really realize, because it meant so much more work.
Yeah. More computational power to train those models. Yeah. I mean, transfer learning is really big. That's like a new big thing, is transfer learning. And I think it can be really fantastic. Transfer learning is where you use a pre-trained model as your penultimate model, and then you add your own data and your own training on top of it. But it's achieved much greater accuracy in classification tasks, because Google's able to do such a more complex pre-training. But we do need to think about that when we're using transfer learning. What are we doing? Are we trying to plop data that is completely different than the pre-trained model on these pre-trained models? So I think transfer learning is going to be really great for the social sciences, but we do have to be careful about what is the distance between our own data and these kind of pre-trained models that we're using, particularly for image data, if people are going to images. So something very much to think carefully about in this new era of deep learning and transfer learning, etc.
Other comments or questions? Yeah, Yvonne?
Yeah, I had a clarifying question. For the analysis that you did, how did you identify the different institutions in that analysis?
Yeah, that came from kind of classic sociological theory. So if you're thinking about how, I was interested in how power is distributed in society and thinking about how different social identities interact with these institutions of power, so cultural, economic power. So if you, I don't know if there are how many are sociologists, but the classic sociological theory when thinking about how power is distributed in society, one is the economy. It's the classic kind of Marxist Weberian analysis that if you have access to economic power, you have power. Weber, of course, had his class power, class, party, and status. So he added politics in there and status, so culture. So you get the economy, culture, politics are kind of three main ways that power is distributed in society. And then from critical theorists like Habermas and feminist theorists, you get the domestic and the public-private split, right? So some people have access to the public realm, the public sphere. Some people are relegated to the private sphere, and that influences how power is distributed. So that's how I get my four main centers of power. So how is power distributed? What types of institutions relegate how power is distributed? And that's how I got the four. There's, of course, more. Religion. I didn't do religion. That's an important center of power in some context. Sexuality, maybe that's a little bit more of a gray area in terms of power. So that's not the only four ways power is distributed, but those are kind of the central way they're theorized. So it comes from theory. A good question there. Violence is another way that power is upheld that I did not include. It's another Weberian theory. So I don't know, read your theory.
Yeah, I think that's it. Certainly here at McMaster, I think at a lot of Canadian universities, there is still that tension between people who are seen as methodologists and people who are seen as theoreticians, and to recognize that the best work comes at that intersection. Any other comments, questions?
I see a comment in the chat. I'm not entirely sure, Bernard, what you mean. I don't know if you can. Yeah, so do I have one coming with this what is the idea I've just presented? Can you just put a sentence on which one you're talking about? I'm not sure.
Oh, looks like
it's typing. So, machine learning in an inductive way. Yeah. Okay. So, in that poetics paper, and he's referencing a poetics paper that specifically, I think it's the leveraging the alignment between machine learning and intersectionality. So it's the paper published on a lot of the empirics that I presented here. So the first part of that paper, I do try to suggest that machine learning is used in an inductive, machine learning is foundationally and fundamentally inductive. And that's what makes it such a nice alignment with intersectionality as a method. So that paper does have in the intro part some arguments about machine learning being an inductive method. I have another paper in the works, and it's not really on inductive machine learning, but it's on thinking about partial perspectives and situated knowledges as a framework rather than kind of this social physics framework, which is this universalizing, we want to come up with universal laws framework, which is the way a lot of computational social scientists work. I propose that we need to be using partial perspectives and situated knowledges frameworks. So we should be looking at partial perspectives. What exactly is your data from? Not trying to talk about intersectionality across all times and all spaces, but intersectionality in the 19th century, and then build that up with a bunch of different partial perspectives. So that can be the framework we use rather than this kind of social physics universalizing perspective. That one is in the works too, which is thinking about a framework that can be more powerful to building up objective computational social science, not this kind of physics, which doesn't really work on social data perspectives. That's coming up and well. But the inductive part really is in that first part of that poetics paper, thinking about the mathematics behind machine learning and how those mathematics are really grounded in data. They are inductive. You're looking for patterns emerging from the data, which is very different than the mathematics of things like regression analysis, which if there are computer scientists in the room learning data science, you were probably told that regression is a machine learning method, which it is in some ways, but it is different. I mean, it is, and but it's different than the kind of way machine learning works. So yeah, that's really in that intro to the front end of that poetics paper. I think is where I get most of that.
All right. Any final questions or comments? All right. Anything last things that you would like to say, Laura?
Gosh, no. I thank you for having me here, and thank you, Joanna, for that message. I'm excited to hear more about what everyone else is doing in this space.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much, Laura. This has been really fascinating. And I suspect that this is really the start of a lot of conversations to come in terms of really raising some awareness about this within particularly the Faculty of Social Science here, that there isn't a lot of this kind of work that's happening here at McMaster, but I think there's a great deal of interest.
Yeah, this is and I don't mean this like casually. I seriously think this is the future, because people are realizing that it's not been working the way that people thought that machine learning should be working. It just hasn't been producing what people thought it would produce. So I think there's great interest in bringing in different paradigms, different types of knowledge to think about how we can really use machine learning productively in the social sciences. So it really is a great moment to be at this intersection of machine learning and social science, because even practitioners, what can we do with this? How can we use this more? How can we leverage this better to get more analytics? So I really do think it's a good moment to be bringing these two conversations together.